Well, this is cool. 8 years ago, Brett was building amazing stuff, and I just left the company in LA where we had to lay off 200 people, and I moved up to sleep on my couch and carried everything with me into U-Haul. But all of that is just to say, like, I feel pretty thankful to be in this position and to share whatever wisdom I've learned over the last 8 years with everyone in the group, and hopefully it's useful. So what I want to talk about today is actually helping everyone in the room do one of two things. Either identify who's going to be your head of growth and who can be exceptional at that, or if you are somebody who works on growth at a particular business, is to give you a repeatable framework where you can develop your skills within that framework and go from good to great and to be exceptional at what you do. Because what I realized over the last 8 years in working on growth and chatting with various companies about the growth initiatives is that 4 years ago, this idea of a growth team was still pretty new. So the number one question that I would receive is, like, do I even need this growth thing? It sounds ridiculous, right? And then I have to chat with them about what a growth team actually does. But the tone of the conversation has switched to where the number one question I get now, which is sort of the next logical step, which is, okay, I understand I need this growth thing, but who the hell do I hire, right? Like, who am I looking for? Who's going to be that exceptional growth leader? Everyone assumes that you're going to be able to find that individual outside the company. What you may find is that you can actually find that person inside the company, and that's the most likely route. But what I'll talk about in specific detail are some of the frameworks that I use for thinking about my job on a daily basis. And again, I think you can reuse that as a repeatable framework. All right, so what function does growth serve? Finn sort of got into this, but I'm going to dive into it a little bit more. And what I'd like you to do is think about growth like a finance team. And if you're the steward of a business and you're running a company and you're thinking about bringing somebody who's a growth leader into your business, because maybe you're 50 or 100 employees and you have great organic growth and now you want to accelerate that, what you want to do when you're interviewing that person is actually find out if they can go beyond the surface level of explaining and understanding what growth does inside of a business, right? They need to be able to go beyond simply saying something like, growth is about measuring and testing stuff. I think at this point we've sort of identified that that's one of the tactics or the skills, but that's not nearly enough. And so I'll give you an example of how I think about growth, and I think you can use this example in the interview process with the individuals that you're interviewing to head up growth for your business. So here's how I think about it. A finance team, by definition, measures, understands, and improves the flow of capital in and out of a business. And that's important because they contribute to all sorts of incredibly important business decisions. Right? Business decisions along the lines of how many people can I hire, what can I pay them, what's the equity and comp schedule going to look like, if we need to find a new office, how big will it be, what can we pay, and where's it going to be at, what is the rate at which we're going to scale other parts of the organization that are capital intensive. So they use that knowledge to help the business operate. But what's interesting is every company, and certainly the finance team, eventually comes to the realization that the single biggest lever that they have for maximizing revenue potential is to actually have more users or have more customers. The revenue products that you build, those in itself are a secondary optimization of scale. And so it's a bit of a cart before the horse scenario in that you build out this really robust finance organization, but you don't build a growth team whose responsibility is to measure, understand, and improve the flow of users or customers in and out of your business or in and out of your product. Right? So that's how I want you to think about growth. That's the role of growth within a business. Finance measures, improves, and understands the flow of capital. Growth measures, understands, and improves the flow of customers in and out of your product and business. And so when you're evaluating ahead of growth, you should be digging into these questions around, how does growth fit into the business? What role do they play? And can they explain something beyond the superficial explanation of, well, they measure and test stuff, right? It's not enough. And then there are 3 particular skills that I also want to focus on when it comes to that individual who's sort of the champion of growth. And this is a definition that I think is closer to a director or executive level. But I think you can water it down a little bit depending on the leveling of the individual you want to bring in. But a head of growth does 3 things, right? First is they contribute to or they build the data models that you use to simply explain how your product grows into scale, right? So it's a very basic data model that captures the core levers that explains why Quora grows, or why Facebook grows, or why LinkedIn grows, or why Twitter, or why Wealthfront grows, right? So that individual needs to have that proficiency. Second is they need to be able to build testing and experimentation programs within the company, right? They need to be able to organize a product design and engineering team around a testing schedule. And they need to be able to justify the experiments that are important. And the third is they need to be able to identify, test, and scale new customer acquisition channels. Those are the three things. If you're going to be an executive level leader on growth, you need to be great at least two of those. If you're great at three, then you've got someone special, okay? And I'll talk about these in a bit more detail. So building growth models. There are two that I want to share. And the first one I actually learned from someone who was my boss and a couple other folks in the room. He was their boss as well. His name is Chamath. He ran growth at Facebook and now runs Social Plus Capital. And this is one of the basic growth equations that he uses at the highest level of assessing whether or not a product or a business has the ability to grow at scale for an extended period of time. And it has these three main components. And as I'm thinking about the products that I'm working on, I follow this religiously. And here are the three components. First is, can that product have a robust top of funnel? Meaning, can it capture traffic, and can you convert that traffic at an increasingly higher rate into some meaningful level of usage? This is more of the tactical bit. I think it's probably the least important parameter in this equation, and I'll explain why in a couple minutes. Second is magic moment. I'll give an example I think a lot of folks here have experienced. Remember the first time I downloaded Uber's app, hailed a car showed up, black car, it picked me up. My friends looked at me like I was cool. I had no idea what was going on. I just knew a car was coming. I didn't realize it was like this fancy limo thing. And then I got in it, they gave me a bottle of water. The person greeted me by name, drove me to the location without making me feel car sick, dropped us all off. No exchange of cash, no driver telling me that they didn't have a credit card reader, none of that stuff. And then I got out and I was like, what the hell? That's what it should be like. And I experience that every time that I fly into LAX and I can't get Uber and I have to take Yellow Cab. It sucks. And so my definition of the magic moment is something that elicits an emotional response in your user of the product. And ideally, you do that early and often in the product experience. Right? We have these experiences with Wealthfront, the product that I get to work on. And one of those experiences actually led to me saying, like, I got to work on this. I went to bed one day. I woke up the next. I logged in and checked my account. And it had captured $3,000 in capital losses for me while I was asleep. It didn't ask me to do anything. It didn't charge me. It just did it. And that's when I realized, like, one, that's cool. I'm going to have more money left over at the end of the year. Two, I got to work on this, right? We can introduce many more emotion eliciting experiences in the product. That's how finance should be. All right, so that's magic moment. Three is core product value. How big is the market? Are you solving a legitimate problem? And was your product market fit hypothesis correct? Right? And what you'll find is that for products that do B and C really well, A naturally happens. It's like the stuff Brett was talking about, right? The top of funnel fills itself. That's when you're in a wonderful position. Right? So when you have tremendous top of funnel growth, you don't even have to fight to fill the top of the funnel. At that point, you just need to remove friction where friction exists and allow the product to grow as big as it can get. All right, so that's framework one. So when you're chatting with the head of growth, you should be asking this person, like, what are your frameworks for evaluating growth of companies, right? Dig into that. Ask that person for a degree of thoughtfulness that you haven't even applied to your own business. But you can make this practical. This is one of my favorite examples. Like when someone comes to me and says, hey, I want to work on growth, and I love your product, one of the first things I say is, okay, well, how do you think we grow? Can you just write a simple diagram on the whiteboard that attempts to express how Wealthfront as a business grows? Can you do that, right? I think that's a basic necessary skill. And I go through this exercise with products pretty commonly on my own time. And usually if I'm engaged with a company one-on-one, it's the first thing that I'll do with them, which is to have a simple expression that captures what you think are the main dynamics around the growth engine for that product or business, right? And I like to use Amazon example. When I look at Amazon, this is what I see at a high level. These are the parameters that I've identified as being part of its growth engine. So let's talk about A, vertical expansion. When Amazon launched, it sold books. So you could say, well, Amazon's growth at that time was contained to or limited by sort of books as a vertical, right? They could sell a certain number of books to a particular size of audience, and then consequently, that's how big it could get, right? So there's some argument there that as it moved into additional verticals, it unlocked additional latent growth potential, and then it could expand its growth at a faster pace, right? And so they moved into music and into jewelry, and they continue to expand on verticals today. So every single time they move into a new vertical, there's a growth function there. And I probably would want a team of people figuring out what verticals do I move into, in what order, and how do I make that a machine. So that's the first one. The second is what I would refer to as sort of the product inventory within that vertical, or the depth. Right? Is Amazon selling 10 books? No, right? They probably want to sell 10 million books, right? They want to sell every book on the planet if they can. And so their growth is proportional to the depth of product inventory. Again, that's another thing that I would focus on, and I'd probably write that on the whiteboard, right? After that, you have something that's more standard. You all of a sudden have these product pages that are all over the web, and they're capable of yielding additional traffic. Now I want to convert that traffic at a higher rate to buyers, to people buying product, right? So that's another variable in their growth. After that is conversion to purchase, and then the average value of each purchase, or the amount that people are spending. And at that point, that's when Amazon was injecting recommendation engines into the product, right? Here's a good example that's sort of relevant to this time of year. I bought a He-Man costume for Halloween. It's gonna be sweet. It's got, like, it's full of, fake muscles and everything. So that's gonna be a lot of fun. And then I was checking out just the He-Man full body suit, and it recommended his sword. And I thought, well, of course I gotta buy that, right? That's a really good example that I just experienced. So my average order value goes up. And then eventually the business gets so sophisticated that they can do things around driving repeat purchase behavior, introducing products such as Amazon Prime, right? And then you just buy and you buy and you buy and you buy. So when you're interviewing a head of growth and they say, hey, I love your business, I love your product, ask them to do this first. If they can't do that, they're full of it, or they're not very good at their job, right? The next thing that a head of growth needs to be able to do is develop rigorous experimentation programs, right? This is more the classic definition of growth, which is run a bunch of A/B tests. But it goes a hell of a lot deeper than that, right? And I want to dig into this using some real-world examples. And what you should be doing when chatting with somebody that wants to run growth for your business is, again, evaluating the depth of their knowledge from an experimentation side of things, right? Asking them questions around, how do you identify what part of the funnel to focus on? Right? How do you identify when to run a test and when not to? How do you identify what is the right test to run versus one that isn't an interesting test to run? Right? And here's some examples. One of the behaviors I've seen is that large companies, they really like small optimizations. And that's because they have a data advantage. Right? At Facebook, there'd be a part of the product where we would generate 100 million visitors per week. So we can run an A/B test to 1% of that traffic, and inside of 24 hours have 100% confidence on the outcome of that experiment. And if it gave us a 5% lift in something like sign-up rate, wonderful. I'm going to do as many of those as fast as possible and collectively add those together and let it compound. Right? And that's exactly what we did. I remember in 2008, I think we exited the year at somewhere around 125, 130 million monthly active users. And then the exec staff and the board went away to set the goal for 2009, and they came back and they said, guess what? You have to grow to 300 million users, which was scary and daunting because it had taken so many years for the company to just get to 100 million. Then they wanted us to get to 300 million. And it turns out that at the time, we were growing roughly at around 1.5% week over week. And if we grew at 2% week over week, well, we could hit that goal. So that's the path that we went down. And so here's a simple example that's probably relevant to some mid-sized companies today. Right, in the first column, you assume that you begin with 10 million users, and you're growing at 1% week over week. So at the end of the first week, you have 10.1 million users. At the end of the year, you have 16.8 million users. That's cool. Pretty good numbers. I'd probably write a check to that. Right? And the column next to it, same company grows at 2% week over week. So they start with 10 million monthly active users. End of the year, they're at 28 million. That's even better. Right? Scenario 3, which is the last column, is you start at 1% week over week growth, but then let's assume that this growth team is working on its active user rate. And every 4 weeks, it improves that growth rate by 5%. And it does that consistently over the next 52 weeks. Then you end up at 30.5 million users, which is more than the second scenario. That's why big companies like small optimizations. And that's where you conjure up the examples of hearing about Google engineers testing 40 different shades of blue on a particular sign-up button. But when you're a smaller company, that stuff just does not work, right? Because you don't have 100 million users to throw a 1% test in front of. You have to do something different. This is probably my favorite graph, which is not scientific or accurate whatsoever. But on one axis, you have thoughtfulness. How thoughtful are you as it relates to the experiments that you're selecting and how you're designing those in the order in which you're implementing them, right? How thoughtful are you? It turns out that when you have tons of traffic, people tend to not be that thoughtful. They have a bunch of half-thought ideas, and you do a bunch of them really quickly, but sometimes that works. When you're a startup and you don't have as much traffic, you have to be incredibly thoughtful, right? Because you have only so many opportunities in which you can run an experiment in the product, and you're time-bound. You said, you know what, I raised $40 million, and that gives me 2 years of runway. So I need to execute and deliver on some numbers within that time box. With that said, you need to run experiments that matter, right? And experiments that matter in the startup world, when you're using smaller samples, have to be incredibly thoughtful. I'll give some specific examples using actual website data. All right, so let's look at the impact of when you produce a large lift in an experiment over the control state, right? So we have example A, example B, and example C. Let's imagine those are 3 A/B tests, right? And look at the column in green. That's the percent change over the control. So that's saying that in example A, we ran that test, and it was 5% better than the control thing you were testing it against. In example C, it was 30% better, right? And then look at the impact on the required sample size you're going to need. So that's saying I need 72,000 samples in the experiment bucket and in the control bucket. And I'm going to have to run that for 72 days in order to detect that that thing is 5% better than the control. That's a lifetime when you're a startup, right? You have 24 months of runway, and you just went through like 2.5 months of it on one A/B test. That's not going to foot the bill, right? And then conversely, when you look at example C, if it's 30% better, you need 2 days. Everyone wants those results. So the lesson in that is be thoughtful, but also be dramatic in the changes that you're willing to make. Be dramatic. Don't take a page and say, here's this button. I'm going to take that button and sort of just move it over there. Or I'm going to give it rounded corners. Right? Or I'm going to try 40 different shades of blue. It's not going to get the job done. You may run that experiment given that you have small traffic sizes. And because of the small lift, you may run that for months or years. So produce dramatic lifts. Then some folks will say, well, what if it's dramatically worse? Like, well, you'll know that inside of 2 days as well, and that's okay. Cut your losses and move on. If it's dramatically better, earn that reward right now and let it compound as fast as you can. Scenario 2. So let's look at the impact of different base conversion rates on the outcome of an experiment and the duration of that experiment. So let me give an example. Let's go back to example A, B, and C. So the base conversion rate just refers to the ultimate conversion, right? So let's say you have 100 people on your home page. You know, like I'm going to run an A/B test all the way, you know, from the home page all the way down to the bottom, right? So I'm going to start with some home page change. But 100 people started on the home page, and 3 of them converted. That's a 3% conversion rate. But let's say I look at some tests somewhere midway through the funnel, and there are only 10 people in a given day that are on that part of the funnel, but 3 convert. That's a 30% base conversion rate. So that's what I'm referring to. The base conversion is usually a proxy for depth in the funnel. The higher the base conversion rate, generally the better, for the same reason. You'll notice that with a high base conversion rate, if I'm starting at a 20% conversion rate, and I lift that by 10%, I can detect that inside of 2 days. Versus the other scenario of I have a very small base conversion rate, and I lift that by 10%. So I'm trying to statistically detect the difference between a 3% conversion rate and a 3.3% conversion rate. Turns out that's hard to do. You need a lot of samples in that test in order to detect it at high confidence. So the lesson here is go deep in funnels. Start there. It's especially true if you have a product that requires a significant sort of purchase decision, right? So if I'm going to buy something worth $1,000 online, and if you want to drive the conversion rate on people actually buying it, don't run a test on the homepage. Run a test at the part of the purchase funnel, right, where they're about ready to enter their credit card details. That's where you want to be testing. You can resolve those tests more quickly, probably because you're dealing with a committed customer. A committed customer is more likely to respond to a different design or experience. That's where you want to be testing. So when you're chatting with whoever's your head of growth, can they explain to you how they pick their spot in the funnel? Right? Usually the response you'll get is, I'm going to test everything because I can test everything really quickly, and I'm just going to throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. That's not your executive leader. Maybe that's a good entry-level person. Maybe that's good enough to get started. Maybe you have somebody internally that can already do that. But what you really, really want is somebody that understands the value and the benefit of intelligent experiment selection and design. All right, so a couple final thoughts. These are just random thoughts that I like to share. You can't sustainably grow something that sucks. So I think the lesson here is, if you don't have healthy organic growth, hiring a growth person is not the solution, right? That's a product challenge. Hiring your growth team or your head of growth, I suggest, happens after you demonstrate organic growth. After you prove, or the organic growth proves that the market appreciates the product that you've introduced to it, and that the market considers it valuable. At that point, growth is fuel on the fire. It's not the thing that starts the fire, right? So you can't sustainably grow something that sucks. Nothing replaces an incredible product. You don't need or want a growth hacker. I say this from a recruiting perspective because it can be more of an anti-signal, right? How many growth hackers do you know have successfully executed on 2, 3, or 4 years worth of growth work at Airbnb or Dropbox or Facebook or Pinterest or Twitter or LinkedIn? I don't know any. But I know a lot of growth hackers that are clever and sophisticated in their own way, and they understand tactics really well, and they've worked on smaller products, but that's just part of it. If you're looking for a growth leader, like, think of it this way. If I'm looking for a head of sales in an enterprise company, am I going to hire a sales hacker? Head of finance, am I hiring a finance hacker? Whatever that is. Sounds like extortion, really, so I don't think, probably not. So I think the optics there are interesting, but don't fall sucker to that, right? You're looking for substance, not title. And your growth lead needs to be a product person, right? Again, it goes back to my message on it. This isn't just about experimentation. And what you may find is that some of the most meaningful product changes that you may actually experiment with come from a deep understanding and empathy for the consumer, for the user of your product, right? With Wealthfront as a business, I think what we're finding is that the most meaningful changes that we can make to the product, that when we test them and they move the numbers in a meaningful way, are actually derivatives of deeper behavioral finance understandings, right? When somebody goes home for a weekend and reads a 30-page white paper that a couple finance researchers had sort of conducted 2 years worth of market research on a company on how to get individuals to contribute to their 401k more often, may find some behavioral finance difference that we can integrate into the product and move the numbers in that way. All right, so your head of growth needs to be a product person, because the risk that you run is that all companies identify themselves on some spectrum of what I would say is sort of the clash of science and art, right? Is your DNA as a company aligned to more of the art style? Like, I'm just going to build great products. I'm not going to look at data whatsoever. I'm not going to test anything. I'm just going to build. And then you have the other side, which is I'm going to measure and test everything. I think companies eventually realize that they need to sort of revert to the mean and strike some balance between the two. But if you hire a head of growth who can only do the science bit, but has no empathy or passion for the value of quality product experiences, I think you're going to create that, or exacerbate that tension between science and art that you probably don't want to exacerbate. So that's it. That's my guidance. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, grab me outside.